I still remember the smell of wet earth more clearly than the sound of gunfire. It was early 1979, during the Cambodian campaign, and our combat engineer platoon had been given an assignment that sounded simple on paper: clear a jungle road before dawn so an infantry battalion could continue its pursuit of a retreating Khmer Rouge force. Intelligence had identified their commander as a ruthless female officer responsible for several deadly ambushes against both civilians and military units. The order passed down the chain was direct: our infantry was to cut off her escape. Before they could move, however, we had to make the road safe. Combat engineers rarely stood at the front of the headlines, but every soldier knew that if we failed, nobody behind us would get very far. My name isn't important anymore. What matters are the men I served beside. There was Hung, a quiet kid from Nam Dinh province. He trusted his aging mine detector more than his own eyes. He hardly spoke unless he absolutely had to. But when he found something buried beneath the soil, he never missed. Then there was Phuc from Quang Nam. He was built like an ox, always volunteering for the heaviest work. During the rare peaceful evenings, he'd tell us about the woodworking shop he planned to open once he returned home. He carried those dreams through the jungle the same way he carried bridge planks, with stubborn determination. As for me, I carried a worn entrenching shovel, several rolls of demolition cord, a dented aluminum canteen, and a small pouch of dehydrated rice that never seemed enough for a day's work. The rain had fallen through most of the night. By the time we stepped into the forest, everything was soaked. Water dripped from giant leaves. Thick mud clung to our boots with every step. The air smelled of damp soil, rotting vegetation, and stagnant water. Somewhere in the distance, birds called to one another before sunrise, while insects buzzed relentlessly around our faces. Nobody wasted words. Every movement had to be deliberate. Hung swept the mine detector slowly across the ground. I followed several feet behind, marking suspicious spots with small sticks before kneeling to scrape away dirt one thin layer at a time. Phuc worked farther back, cutting fallen trees and clearing brush so the road would be wide enough for trucks and armored vehicles. One careless swing of the shovel could end all three of us. Our battalion commander had warned us that retreating Khmer Rouge units often planted fresh mines after heavy rain. Floodwater shifted the ground, erased footprints, and disguised every warning sign experienced engineers usually relied upon. That morning, the jungle seemed almost too quiet. Even our breathing felt loud. Every few hundred yards, we paused to take small bites of dehydrated rice and swallow warm water from our dented canteens. Nobody complained about the food. Hunger had become another piece of equipment we carried every day. Time mattered. Somewhere behind us, hundreds of infantrymen waited for the road to open. Somewhere ahead, a dangerous enemy commander was trying to disappear deeper into the forest. We resumed our slow advance. Hung lowered the detector once more, moving it carefully over what appeared to be an ordinary stretch of muddy trail. Then the machine gave off a sharp metallic tone. He froze. He scanned again. Another tone. Then another. His expression changed immediately. Without looking back, he raised one clenched fist, the silent signal every combat engineer feared. I crawled beside him and looked at the untouched ground ahead. To anyone else, it was just another patch of mud. To us, it had suddenly become the most dangerous place in the jungle. Hung did not say a word after the detector screamed. He only looked at me, then pointed two fingers toward the ground. That was enough. I eased myself forward, keeping my chest low and my elbows pressed into the mud. In our line of work, a man learned that fear was not the enemy. Carelessness was. The trail ahead looked ordinary. Wet leaves, soft brown mud, a few broken twigs. To an infantryman in a hurry, it might have looked clear. But to us, the silence of that place felt staged, like someone had swept the floor before leaving a trap behind. I took out my probe and began working the soil inch by inch. The first mine sat only a few inches below the surface. It was buried beneath a thin layer of mud and dead leaves. Positioned right where a boot would naturally land, Hung marked it with a small stick. Fuck, who had been clearing brush behind us, stopped swinging his machete and came closer without stepping into the trail. "How many?" he whispered. I shook my head. Too early to know. We kept working. One mine became 3. 3 became 6. By the time the sky began turning gray above the tree line, we knew this was not an old minefield left behind in panic. It was fresh, careful, meant to slow us down, then kill the men who tried to clear it. That was the part that always made my stomach tighten. Mines did not care whether you were brave, young, tired, hungry, or thinking about home. They waited without anger and without mercy. Hung moved the detector again. Another signal, then another. The pattern made no sense at first. The mines were not laid in a straight line. They curved off the road, then returned to it, forming a broken pocket. Whoever planted them wanted us to think we had found the main danger while the real killing zone sat just beyond it. I remembered the battalion waiting behind us. I remembered the order. Open a lane wide enough for the pursuit force to move before daylight. Somewhere ahead, that female Pon Pot commander was buying time with every minute we lost. "Can we blow it?" Fuck asked. I looked at the trees pressing in on both sides of the road. If we used demolition cord and set off the field, the sound would roll through the jungle like thunder. The enemy would know exactly where we were and how far we had advanced. Worse, some mines might jump, scatter fragments, and tear up the trail so badly that trucks could not pass. "No," I said, "we do it by hand." Nobody argued. That was another thing about combat engineers. We often did the most dangerous work in the quietest way possible. No speeches, no big gestures, just mud under the fingernails and death sitting close enough to touch. For the next hour, the three of us barely breathed. Hung swept, I probed, Fuck cut narrow side gaps and dragged away branches without shaking the ground. We marked each mine, cleared around it, and exposed the firing mechanism slowly. My hands were numb from mud and tension. Leeches clung to my ankles. Mosquitoes whined near my ears, but I did not dare slap them. At one point, my shovel scraped a buried wire. I froze. The wire ran under a root, then disappeared beneath a patch of leaves beside the trail. I brushed the mud away with my fingertips and found a second device. Smaller than the first, hidden where a man kneeling to disarm the main mine might place his knee. That was when I knew we were dealing with someone experienced. Not just cruel, patient. Fuck saw it too. His face hardened, but he said nothing. He only reached into his pocket, pulled out a small strip of cloth, and tied it around a low branch as a warning marker for the men behind us. When we finally opened a narrow lane, the sun was already lifting. Pale and weak, through the canopy, I stood for the first time in what felt like hours, my knees shaking under me. Then Hung pointed to the edge of the minefield. There, pressed into the wet mud, was a footprint. Fresh. Small. Made by a sandal, not a combat boot. The toes faced deeper into the jungle. Whoever had planted this field had not gone far. The fresh footprint changed everything. Until that moment, we had been fighting the ground. Mud, roots, buried metal, hidden wire. Those were things a combat engineer could understand. But a fresh sandal print at the edge of a minefield meant human eyes might still be watching us from somewhere beyond the trees. Hung crouched beside the track and studied it like a farmer reading weather in the sky. "Made this morning," he whispered. Fuck looked into the jungle, his hand tightening around the handle of his machete. He was not a nervous man, but I saw his jaw move once, like he was biting down on whatever he wanted to say. A runner from battalion headquarters came up behind us a few minutes later, moving carefully through the lane we had marked. His uniform was soaked through, and his face was gray from lack of sleep. "The commander wants the road open faster," he said. "The pursuit group is losing time." I wanted to tell him that mines did not care about orders. I wanted to ask him if he knew how thin the space was between a cleared road and a row of dead men. But he was only carrying the message. And in war, many men carried burdens they had not chosen. So I nodded. Then he lowered his voice. New information came in. The Pon Pot unit ahead is being led by a woman. They say she commanded ambushes along the border. Villagers who survived called her cold-blooded. She's trying to pull her people west before we close the gap. None of us answered right away. Back then, most of what we heard came in pieces. One report from a scout. One warning from a villager. One rumor passed from unit to unit. I did not know her face. I did not know her real name. But I knew what her retreat had already cost us. The minefield under our hands was part of her answer to being chased. The order was clear. Stop her before she disappeared into deeper jungle. Our job was also clear. Make the road passable. That was the strange thing about combat engineers. We were tied to the battle, but often from the side of it. Infantrymen pushed forward with rifles. Artillerymen sent shells over the trees. Medics pulled life back into men who were slipping away. We opened the path. We fixed what was broken. We stepped first where everyone else needed to walk. I looked at Hung and Fuck. Hung had mud on his cheek and both hands wrapped around the mine detector like it was the only honest thing in the world. Fuck stood beside a pile of cut branches, breathing hard, his sleeves rolled up, his arms covered with scratches. He had once told me he wanted to build wooden doors after the war, solid doors for quiet houses. Doors that closed against rain instead of bullets. Men like that should not have been crawling through jungle roads looking for death under leaves. But that was where we were. We pushed forward again. The minefield forced us to bend the cleared lane slightly to the left. That meant cutting through heavier brush and removing a fallen tree half sunk in mud. Fuck took the axe and worked in short, controlled swings. He did not chop like a man in a hurry. He chopped like a man who understood that the ground beneath him might be listening. Behind us, infantry began forming up in silence. I could feel their impatience. I could also feel their trust. Every man waiting there knew he was depending on our hands. Then the radio operator near the rear called out softly. His set had gone dead. At first we thought water had gotten into the equipment. The operator checked the battery, wiped the contacts, adjusted the antenna. Nothing, only static. The jungle seemed to close tighter around us. No radio meant no clear word from command. No update from the scouts. No warning if the enemy shifted position. Ahead of us was a fresh trail. Beneath us was a minefield. Behind us was a battalion waiting to move. I looked down at the narrow strip of mud we had cleared. For the first time that morning, I understood that the road was no longer just a road. It had become a race. By mid-morning, the road ended at a stream that no longer looked like a stream. On the map, it was marked as a shallow crossing, the kind a truck could crawl through in low gear if the driver knew what he was doing. But the night rain had changed everything. Brown water rushed between the banks, swollen and angry, carrying branches, leaves, and clumps of torn grass. The small wooden bridge that had once crossed it was gone. Only 2 broken posts remained, leaning sideways like rotten teeth. I stood there with mud up to my knees and felt the weight of the whole column pressing behind us. The infantry could not chase anyone across that water without help. The trucks could not pass. The wounded, if there were any later, could not be carried back quickly. For combat engineers, a broken crossing was not just an obstacle. It was a question. How many men would pay for every minute we lost? Fuck spat into the mud and looked at the current. She took the bridge from us, he said. He did not need to say who she was. We were all thinking about the female Pon Pot commander somewhere ahead. using rain, mines, and water the way other people used weapons. We had 2 small assault boats and sections of a light pontoon bridge dragged forward by hand. The trucks carrying heavier equipment were still far behind, slowed by the minefield we had just cleared. That meant we had to improvise. Hung checked the near bank first. He moved slowly with the mine detector, sweeping around the broken bridge posts and the muddy approach. Water made the machine complain with false sounds, but Hung knew how to listen past the noise. Twice he stopped us from stepping near buried metal. One was a rusted can. The other was not. We uncovered a small mine tucked beside the old path down to the water. I remember staring at it and feeling no anger, only exhaustion. Even a man running for his life had taken the time to leave death behind for strangers. We disarmed it by hand. After that, nobody walked anywhere without Hung clearing the ground first. The jungle on the far side was thick and dark. Vines hung low over the water, and the trees stood so close together they seemed to hide whatever moved among them. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something beyond the rush of the stream, a snapped branch, a low voice, the click of metal. Maybe it was real, maybe it was fear making shapes out of noise. We pushed the first boat into the water. Fuck and I climbed in with a rope coil and one end of the pontoon line. The current grabbed us at once. It twisted the boat sideways and shoved us toward a half-submerged log. Fuck dug his paddle hard into the water, his face tight with effort. I held the rope against my chest and prayed my hands would not slip. Halfway across, the far bank came alive. One shot cracked through the trees. Then another. The sound was flat and sharp, different from the deep roll of battle. Sniper fire. The boat rocked as Fuck threw himself low. I dropped into the bottom, my cheek against wet wood, one hand still locked around the rope. A bullet hit the water close enough to splash mud across my face. On our side of the stream, men shouted for cover, then fell silent. Nobody wanted to fire blindly and give away more positions. Hung was still on the near bank. I saw him crawl behind a stump, his detector lying beside him like a useless piece of farm equipment. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. The rope in my hands pulled tight. If I let go, the boat would drift, and the crossing would fail. If I held on, I might not live long enough to tie it off. For a few seconds, the whole war narrowed down to that muddy rope burning across my palms. The 1st Infantry Squad crossed after we secured the rope. They moved fast but not carelessly, one man at a time, shoulders low, rifles held above the muddy water. The little pontoon line shook under their weight. Every step sent ripples across the brown current. On the far bank, Fuck and I lay half buried in wet grass, holding the guide rope down so it would not swing loose. The sniper fired twice more, then stopped. That silence bothered me more than the shots. A man who fires and runs is one thing. A man who fires and waits is another. Somewhere in that dark tree line, someone had decided to let us continue. That usually meant the real trap was farther ahead. By noon, the infantry had pushed past the stream and disappeared into the jungle. We heard them only in pieces. A branch cracking, a low command, the dull clink of equipment. Our engineer team was ordered to follow at the rear, keeping the crossing usable for stretchers, supplies, and any vehicles that might come up later. That was how combat engineers often moved, never fully behind the war, never fully ahead of it. We lived in the dangerous space between movement and disaster. Fuck checked the pontoon lashings one last time. His hands were raw from rope burn, but he grinned anyway. When I opened my woodshop, he said, "I'm never tying another rope again." Hung, who rarely joked, answered, "You'll tie doors for rich people and complain about the price of nails." For a moment, we laughed quietly, not because it was very funny, but because we needed to remember we were still men and not just tools being pushed through mud. Then the radio crackled weakly. Only a few words came through. The pursuit had made contact with the rear guard of the Pon Pot unit. The female commander was believed to be moving west with a small escort. Our infantry needed the trail cleared ahead so they could close the distance before dark. We packed up and moved. The jungle after the stream was different. The ground rose into low ridges, then dropped into pockets of standing water. Thick roots crossed the trail like old bones. Bamboo grew close together, forcing us to cut narrow lanes with machetes. Every fresh mark in the mud mattered. Every broken branch might mean the enemy had passed, or it might mean they wanted us to think so. Hung led with the mine detector. I watched his shoulders. That was how I knew what the ground was telling him. When he was relaxed, the machine swept steady and smooth. When danger came, his whole body changed. He became smaller, tighter, as if he were trying not to disturb the air itself. About an hour beyond the stream, he stopped. The trail ahead dipped between two low banks. At first glance it looked harmless, just another muddy cut through the trees. But there was a thin vine stretched across it at ankle height. Too straight. Too clean. I raised my hand, and everyone froze. I crawled forward slowly. The vine was not a vine at all. It was a wire, smeared with mud and twisted with plant fibers. It crossed the trail, disappeared into the brush, then came back out again near a fallen log. A simple tripwire would have been bad enough. This was something else. I brushed away leaves near the log and found a charge packed beneath the rotten wood. Then another, a chain. If one man tripped the wire, the blast would tear through the whole file. Fuck's face lost its color. "Can you cut it?" he whispered. "Not yet," I said. There were too many possible triggers. Cut the wrong side, lift the wrong branch, move the wrong stone, and the entire trail would vanish in fire and dirt. Behind us, the infantry commander sent a runner forward. He did not step past our markers. He was young, maybe 20, with red-rimmed eyes and a dry mouth. "They need the lane open," he said. "They're close." I nodded without looking at him. Close to the enemy, close to dark, close to making a mistake. I lay on my stomach and followed the wire with the tip of my knife. Clearing mud grain by grain. Sweat ran into my eyes. Mosquitoes settled on my neck. Somewhere far ahead, a short burst of AK fire cracked through the jungle. Then Hung shifted his weight beside me. I heard it before I saw it. A small, ugly click beneath his boot. Hung froze, one foot planted in the mud, his face suddenly empty. None of us moved. The pursuit continued ahead of us, but our whole world had stopped under one man's heel. Hung did not scream. That is what I remember most. His face went pale, his eyes dropped toward his boot, and his whole body became still as a tree stump. The little click under his heel had been soft, almost polite, but every combat engineer knew what it meant. Somewhere beneath the mud, a firing mechanism had moved. Maybe the mine had armed itself. Maybe it was waiting for pressure to lift. Maybe the mud had jammed it just enough to give us a few minutes. Or maybe we were already dead and did not know it yet. "Don't move," I whispered. Hung gave the smallest nod. Fuck took one step forward before I raised my hand. He froze too. Behind us, the infantry runner crouched beside a tree, his mouth half open, too scared even to ask a question. The jungle went strangely quiet. Far ahead, the short bursts of AK fire continued, then faded, then started again. The pursuit was still moving. The order still existed. The female Pon Pot commander was still trying to escape west. But for us, everything had narrowed to the size of Hung's boot. I slid my knife back into its sheath and lowered myself flat into the mud. The tripwire charge beside the fallen log was still unfinished business, but I could not leave Hung standing on a mine while I cleared the road. A lane did not matter if the man who opened it died under my nose. "Fuck," I said, barely louder than breath. "Hold his shoulder. Don't pull. Just steady him." Fuck crawled in from behind, careful not to disturb the wire. His big hands rested lightly on Hung's back and arm. I saw how gently he touched him, as if Hung were made of thin glass. Hung tried to speak. I shook my head. When a man is standing on a mine, words only make the waiting harder. I began digging with my fingers. Not with the shovel, not with the probe. Fingers first, mud by mud, grain by grain. The soil was wet enough to move, but thick enough to cling under my nails. Roots tangled around the boot. Dead leaves stuck to my wrists. Sweat ran down my nose and dripped into the dirt, though the air was cool under the canopy. After a few minutes, I saw the edge of the mine casing. It was smaller than I expected. That made it worse. Small mines were easy to miss, easy to hide, and cruelly good at tearing away feet and legs without killing a man quickly. Hung's breathing became rough. "Think about home," I whispered. He gave a weak, crooked smile. "My mother will kill me if I lose this boot," he said. Fuck let out one short laugh, then swallowed it. His eyes were wet, but his hands stayed steady. That was courage, not shouting, not charging, just staying still when every nerve in your body wants to run. I cleared more mud. The mine sat under the outer edge of Hung's soul. His weight had pressed down on it, but not fully. A root had caught part of the casing and kept it from shifting. One ugly little root had saved his life, at least for the moment. The infantry runner whispered from behind us. "They're calling for the lane. They're engaged up front." I did not answer. There are moments in war when the mission stands on one side and a friend stands on the other. Men who write orders never want to admit that. They draw arrows on maps and call it movement. But on the ground, every arrow has faces. I looked at Hung's boot. Then I looked toward the trail where the tripwire waited. If I stayed with Hung, the pursuit might stall. If I left him, he might die before I returned. I made my choice. "The lane waits," I said. "We get him off first." No one argued. Fuck tightened his grip. I slid one hand beneath Hung's boot and felt the cold metal under the mud. Ahead of us, gunfire rolled through the jungle again. Louder this time. The battle was moving without us. And I had one chance to move my friend without killing us all. The message reached us in broken pieces. The radio was still weak from the rain, and every word came through under a blanket of static. The operator pressed the handset tight against his ear, repeating what he could hear. The pursuit force had pushed into contact. The Pon Pot rearguard was falling back in small groups. The female commander was believed to be less than a mile ahead, moving toward a dry ridge that led west. Then the order came. "Keep the route open. Clear the last obstacle. Do not let her escape." I looked at Hung, still frozen over the buried mine. His lips pressed together so tightly they had turned white. Fuck had one hand on his shoulder and the other braced in the mud. He was sweating hard now, not from heat, but from holding still too long. The order made sense from far away. On a map, it was simple. One red arrow moving west, one blue arrow trying to cut it off. A road, a stream, a ridge, a closing gap. But the men who drew those arrows did not have Hung's boot under their hands. They did not smell the wet dirt. They did not hear the faint scrape of metal beneath a friend's heel. I did not hate them for it. Commanders had to think about the whole fight. But combat engineers had to think about the next inch. I told Fuck to keep Hung steady. Then I slid my fingers deeper into the mud around the mine casing. The metal was cold and slick. I could feel the pressure plate, partly depressed but not fully seated. The root that had caught it was still holding. That thin root was all the mercy we had. "Can you get me off?" Hung whispered. "Yes," I said. I did not know if that was true. Sometimes, in war, you say what a man needs to hear before your hands know how to make it real. The infantry runner returned, crawling this time, careful to stay inside our marked lane. "Sir, They need movement, he said. They're almost on her. I looked past him at the tripwire charge still blocking the trail. Beyond that, the path climbed through bamboo toward the ridge. If we cleared it quickly, the infantry could press forward and maybe cut off the commander everyone had been chasing since dawn. If we delayed, she might vanish into the deeper forest. And every mine we had cleared, every rope we had tied, every risk we had taken might end as nothing more than mud and sweat. But if I turned away from Hung, he could die standing there. Worse, Fuck might try to save him alone and die with him. That was the true weight of command at our level. Not speeches, not flags, just choosing which burden your heart could carry for the rest of your life. I took one slow breath. Fuck, I said, when I tell you, lift his weight straight up. No twisting, no pulling back, straight up. Fuck nodded. His face looked older than it had that morning. Hung, I said, when your foot comes free, you let us move you. Don't help, don't fight us. He gave a tiny nod. I wedged my knife handle beneath the edge of the pressure plate, not to pry it up, only to keep it from shifting fast. Then I packed wet mud tight against one side of the casing, using it like a brace. It was ugly work, not textbook, not something an instructor would praise. But the jungle did not give us clean problems. Now, I whispered. Fuck lifted. Hung rose slowly, 1 inch, then 2. The plate trembled beneath my fingers. For one terrible second, I felt it move. I pushed down with everything I had, expecting the world to burst open. Nothing happened. Fuck dragged Hung backward into the cleared lane. Hung collapsed on his side, gasping like a man pulled from deep water. I kept my hand on the mine until both of them were clear. Only then did I breathe. There was no cheering, no celebration, just 3 men covered in mud, alive by a margin too small to measure. Then another burst of AK fire cracked from the ridge ahead. The runner looked at me. The trail was still blocked. The order still stood. And now I had to decide whether to finish clearing the path, or stay with Hung, who could barely stand. I did not have the luxury of making a clean decision. Hung was alive, but his legs shook so badly he could not stand without leaning against Fuck. His face had no color left in it. The mine had not exploded, but part of him had been left on that patch of mud anyway. Fear can wound a man in places no medic can bandage. The infantry runner waited beside me, eyes fixed on the blocked trail. I knew what he wanted. I also knew he was too young to say it. We had to move. The tripwire charge still sat ahead of us, stretched across the only usable path toward the ridge. Behind it lay the route the infantry needed to close the trap around the female Pon Pot commander. Behind me stood Hung, breathing hard, one hand locked around Fuck's sleeve like a child holding on in a storm. For a moment, I hated the road, I hated the mud, I hated every hidden wire, every cold piece of metal, every order that forced men to measure one life against many. Then I looked at Fuck. Can you keep him back? I asked. Fuck understood before I finished speaking. He glanced at Hung, then toward the trail. His mouth tightened. I can, he said, but don't take long. He tried to make it sound like a joke. It was not. I handed him my dented canteen and the small pouch of dehydrated rice from my chest pocket. If he shakes too much, give him water, keep him talking. Hung shook his head. I can still work. No, I said, today you stay alive, that's your job. He looked like he wanted to argue, but nothing came out. I crawled forward alone. The mud was colder now, or maybe I only noticed it because my hands had started trembling. I pressed my elbows into the ground and moved toward the tripwire charge, keeping my body inside the narrow strip we had already cleared. The wire was still there, dirty and tight, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Ahead, the fighting grew sharper. AK fire cracked in bursts. Then came heavier weapons. Then shouting. swallowed quickly by the trees. The pursuit force had made contact again. Every second I spent on that wire was another second the commander ahead might use to escape. I forced myself to slow down. That is the first lesson of engineer work. When everyone else is in a hurry, you become slower, not lazy, not afraid, slower because the ground punishes speed. I found the first charge beneath the rotten log, then the second, then a third buried under leaves near the bank of the trail. They were connected in a chain. Crude but smart, the wire did not lead to one explosion. It led to a wall of them. I could not simply cut it. I traced the line back with the tip of my knife, clearing each bend with my fingers. Twice, I found small wooden stakes holding tension in the wire. Once, I found a secondary line running off to the side where a man might crawl to avoid the first one. Whoever set this had expected engineers. That thought made the back of my neck prickle. The woman ahead was not just running. She was shaping the ground behind her, turning every yard into a question. Finally, I found the safest point to break the system. I packed wet mud around the nearest charge to hold it steady, slid a small stick beneath the wire to take the tension, and cut one strand at a time. The wire relaxed. Nothing exploded. I lay there for 3 full breaths before moving again. Then I marked the charges for later disposal and waved the infantry forward through the cleared lane. Men passed me in silence, boots splashing mud near my face, rifles pointed toward the ridge. One of them touched my shoulder as he went by. No words, just that brief pressure. It was enough. Fuck helped hung limp behind the last squad. I rose and followed, my knees weak, my hands caked with mud. We were trying to catch up when the gunfire ahead suddenly swelled, then broke into a long, ragged silence. A message came back through the line. The target had been reached. The female commander was down. No one cheered. We just kept walking through the wet jungle, because the road behind us was still full of things waiting to kill whoever came next. When the word came back that the female Pon Pot commander was dead, nobody celebrated. That may sound strange to people who have only seen war in movies. They expect men to shout, raise rifles, slap each other on the back. But real soldiers, especially tired ones, often receive victory the way they receive rain, with silence and a lowered head. We were too exhausted to feel proud. The infantry had caught up with her escort near the ridge. There had been a short fight, hard and close. Then it was over. I never saw her body. I never wanted to. To me, she remained what she had been all day, a force somewhere ahead of us, shaping mud and wire and fear into obstacles for other men to die on. Our work was not finished just because the shooting had slowed. The road behind the infantry still had to be made safe. Supply bearers needed to come forward. Medics needed a path out. The pontoon crossing had to hold. Any stretcher party moving in the dark would depend on every mark we had placed and every mine we had found. So we turned around and went back into the trail. That was the part civilians rarely understand. In war, after the loud moments end, the quiet dangers remain. A bullet passes and is gone. A mine waits. It can wait for a truck driver, a medic, a prisoner, a farmer, even a child years later. For combat engineers, the end of a fight often meant the beginning of the most careful work. Hung insisted on walking with us. His legs were still weak, and his face looked hollow. But he picked up the mine detector again. I told him to rest. He ignored me. If I sit down, he said, I'll start thinking. I understood that too well. Fuck stayed close to him, carrying extra gear without being asked. He joked once about charging Hung rent for leaning on him, but his voice had lost its usual spark. We worked our way back toward the chained charges I had marked earlier. This time there was no rush to open the lane for the pursuit. That made the work safer, but not easier. Tension leaves the body slowly. My hands shook when I tied off the first length of demolition cord. I had to stop, close my fingers into fists, and breathe until the tremor passed. The jungle smelled heavier in the afternoon. Wet earth, burned powder, crushed leaves, sweat gone sour under uniforms. Somewhere nearby, a wounded man moaned as medics moved him toward the stream. Nobody spoke louder than necessary. We neutralized the charges one by one. Hung found 2 more mines beside the trail, both placed where men would naturally step while avoiding the obvious danger. Fuck uncovered a shallow pit lined with sharpened bamboo, hidden under leaves. He stared into it for a long time, then covered it back carefully after we marked it. That could have been any of us, he said. None of us answered. By late afternoon, the first stretcher team came through. One of the wounded was an infantryman I had seen earlier waiting behind our cleared lane. He had touched my shoulder while passing. Now his eyes were closed, his uniform dark with blood at the side. He was still breathing. I watched him go and felt no triumph at all. Only a question I could not put into words. How many lives had been saved by opening that road? How many had been spent because it opened? War never gives clean answers. It only gives you faces to remember. Near dusk, Fuck began to stumble. At first, I thought he had slipped in the mud. Then he did it again. His lips were dry, and his eyes had that glassy look we all feared. Malaria had been moving through the unit for weeks, taking strong men and turning them into shivering children overnight. He tried to wave us off. Just tired, he said. But when I touched his forehead, it burned under my palm. Hung took one side of him. I took the other. The man who had helped drag everyone else forward could barely lift his boots. Behind us, the ridge was quiet. Ahead of us, the stream waited in the fading light. And this time, the road we had opened had to carry one of our own back alive. We got Fuck across the stream just after dark. The pontoon bridge groaned under our weight, and the brown water slapped against the floats like it was trying to pull us all back. Hung limped on one side of him. I held the other, and Fuck hung between us, burning with fever and still trying to joke. If I die here, he muttered, tell my mother I fought the river and won. You're not dying, Hung said. His voice was rough, almost angry. Maybe he was talking to Fuck. Maybe he was talking to himself. After standing on that mine, Hung had become quieter than before, but something in him had hardened too. He would not let go of Fuck's arm, not even when the medics reached us on the far bank. They laid Fuck on a poncho beneath a wet tarp and started working on him by flashlight. Someone gave him quinine. Someone else checked his pulse. His teeth chattered so hard I thought they might crack. The man who had carried ropes, chopped bamboo, dragged bridge sections, and laughed at danger all day was suddenly small under that tarp. That is how war humbles you. 1 hour a man is holding up everyone else. The next hour, everyone else is holding him. We stayed beside him until a rear evacuation team arrived. Hung sat in the mud with the mine detector across his lap. I remember looking at that machine, dented and scratched, and thinking it had heard more death beneath the earth than any man should. Fuck survived. It took days before his fever broke, but he survived. Years later, I heard he did make it home to Quang Nam. I do not know if he ever opened the woodworking shop he dreamed about. I like to imagine he did. I like to imagine him sanding a door smooth with both hands, measuring twice before cutting once, the way good engineers and good carpenters always do. Hung stayed with the unit until our rotation ended. He never spoke much about the mine. Men like him rarely explained what they carried inside. But after that day, whenever we cleared a trail, he checked the ground twice, then a third time, not because he lacked confidence, but because he knew confidence could kill. As for me, I came home with fewer belongings than I had carried into Cambodia. One of them was my old aluminum canteen. It was dented on one side from the day I threw myself down near the stream under sniper fire. The cap leaked if you turned it wrong. The metal smelled faintly of old water no matter how many times I washed it. My wife once asked why I kept such a useless thing. I told her it was not useless. That canteen remembered. It remembered the taste of warm water after a mouthful of dehydrated rice. It remembered wet earth under my fingernails. It remembered Hung's boot resting on a mine and Fuck's hands steadying him from behind. It remembered the rope burning across my palms, the pontoon shaking in the current, and the jungle going silent after the final gunfire near the ridge. People sometimes ask old soldiers what victory felt like. I never know how to answer. That day, the mission was completed, the road was opened, the female Pon Pot commander did not escape. On paper, someone probably wrote it down as success. But paper does not remember the smell of mud. Paper does not remember a young man shaking under a tarp with malaria. Paper does not remember how quiet men become after walking through a road built from fear. Now, many years later, I keep that dented canteen on a shelf. Sometimes I hold it and run my thumb over the deepest scar in the metal. When I do, I no longer think first about the order to destroy an enemy commander. I think about Hung and Fuck. I think about 3 combat engineers opening one muddy yard at a time so other men could live long enough to go home. And I think that if there was anything worth saving in that war, it was not glory. It was the hand of a friend refusing to let go.